This is on. Hello? Hello? It is. Yes, welcome to St Giles Parish Rooms. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and also some new ones today. It's my huge pleasure to welcome Father Timothy to give a talk. I might say I'm doubly glad and grateful to him because about 18 months ago, when I was just beginning to think about the Benedictine series, he said, why don't you do one on Dominican spirituality? So this is why we're all here today. He needs no real introduction to most of you. Very well-known scholar, has written many, many books and publications, and has recently come back from a 3-week trip to Algeria, a very, very important conference there. I'm sure you, or particularly you Catholics, will hear a great deal more about that. I hope I do as well. He's going to talk on the government of Dominican spirituality. And in case you think that might be a little tedious, I am absolutely sure that it will not. So, welcome, Timothy.
Thank you very much, Georgie. Yes, I'd like to talk to you about the spirituality of Dominican government. I think this is so much at the heart of our lives that really I would like to have started the whole series with it. As Georgie said, I was in Algeria, where I was very nearly taken hostage in the northern Sahara. It is all very exciting. I just managed to escape due to the quick reactions of the driver, who is the local bishop, a Dominican. Should be a new test, I think, for bishops, whether they got quick reactions when they're driving. So I'm actually really quite lucky to have got back to you. I hope that George is right and that this won't seem all too boring. Normally, when we think about religion, the assumption is that religion is a bit institutionalized, it's about rules, it's bossy, whereas what attracts people today is spirituality, which is humane and gentle and kind. And so it must seem almost a contradiction in terms to want to talk about the spirituality of government. That sounds like a contradiction in terms. Now, if you go to the bookshops, you'll find lots of religious orders producing their books on spirituality. You get the wonderful humane spirituality of St. Benedict, which led to the refoundation of Western civilization after the barbarians. I love it. You get the glorious spirituality of the Franciscans, with Francis's love of the whole of creation. You've been hearing a great deal, I gather, about the spirituality of the Jesuits and the spiritual exercises. Or you get this wonderful mystical spirituality of the Carmelites, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross. So when you come to the Dominicans, it might look like a bit of a flop, really. We've drawn the short straw, the spirituality of government. But I hope that by the end of this session, you will agree that it is beautiful and deeply humane. And it's all about how we are of one heart and one mind. Now, before I start talking about the spirituality of government, Georgie suggested it would be a good idea just to say a very brief word about St. Dominic, because you mightn't know anything about it. And then I'll say a very brief word about how our government works in practice, and then I'll get down to the meaty stuff, which is the spirituality of government. 2 weeks ago, I was in the Sahara, and I was staying with some Franciscan sisters. And although Francis and Dominic were friends, and our orders are cousins, you might say, this sister admitted that she didn't know anything about Dominic. And in a way, that's jolly good and typical. Because Dominic was a preacher. And preachers don't want to get in the way of the gospel. Preachers are like John the Baptist, who said, "He must increase and I must decrease." A good preacher gets out of the way. And that's why St. Dominic was the perfect founder of an order of preachers, because he didn't want to draw attention to himself. He was just one of the brethren. The early Franciscans were fascinated by Francis, and as soon as possible they started producing biographies of Francis. But the Dominicans didn't. We didn't write at the beginning a life of St. Dominic. Instead we wrote something called the Vitae Fratrum, the lives of the brethren, because Dominic was just one of the brethren. I remember when Eamon Duffy came to visit me in Rome when I was master of the order. He said, "You know, it's impossible to be a successor of St. Francis. Everybody falls short. But you can be a successor of St. Dominic, because he didn't want to be too important." Briefest biographical information. There are some seats, there's one seat at the front, and you can squeeze close to Georgie if you're very lucky. A couple of seats down here. And there are some seats on the benches too.
We'll move around and have a seat. On a seat.
So the briefest of biographical information about bibliographical information about Dominic. Born probably in about 1171-72. He was the son of minor Spanish nobility. He became a canon of Osma, and in 1203 he was sent on a mission to the north of Europe with his bishop, Bishop Diego. And on the way back, they stopped in the southwest of France, and he spent the night talking to an Albigensian innkeeper. All night long they talked, and in the morning the man returned to Christianity. Albigensianism was a deeply dualistic religion, which thought that the body was evil, while the creation was evil. You know, sometimes when Jesuits and Dominicans meet, we have polite little conversations about which is the best order. And a Dominican said one day to a Jesuit, he said, "Well, we were founded to oppose the Albigensians. You were founded to oppose the Protestants. When did you last meet an Albigensian?" Now, in this little first meeting, which really is at the seed of the foundation of the order, you see a couple of elements which I think are absolutely typical of our way of being, our spirituality, and which get enshrined in our way of government. First of all, it's a night of debate. And as one of my Irish brethren said, Dominic couldn't have spent the whole night saying, "You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong." There must have been also listening. And at the heart of our life is the belief that through debate we arrive at shared truth. The motto of the order is veritas, truth. Now, I have to tell you that one day a man was floating over the south of England in a hot air balloon. And he floated around, he had no idea where he was, but he came down in a tree. And two people were walking by, and he said, "Help, help, where am I?" And one of them said, "You're in a tree." And he replied, "You must be a Dominican." And he said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because what you say is true, but completely useless." Secondly, during this night-long debate, surely they shared a few glasses of wine. And that the joy of life together is also essential for our spirituality. For the early Dominicans, wine was the great metaphor for the gospel. The preacher had to broach the barrel of wine, of the good news. It seems not only to have been a metaphor. In the early 13th century, you have decisions in general chapters that if the brethren drink too much wine after Compline, they must recite Compline again, and we are warned not to leave the empties outside the back door, as it'll only scandalise the neighbours. My favourite story of St. Dominic is that he came back late one night to our first monastery in Rome of the nuns, San Sisto Vecchio, and he summoned all the nuns to come down and hear about his preaching. And he said, "We need something to drink," he said. So a glass of wine was produced, and the story goes that it was passed around all the nuns, and Dominic said, "Drink deeply, my sisters, drink deeply." And the wine, of course, was never finished. So it's not surprising that we tend to have a fondness for pubs. I was in Liège recently, where we just opened a new priory, and right in the inside the priory there is a wonderful functioning pub where students from all over the university come. So to speed on, here we see the seed of the foundation of the order of preachers. Religious life until then had largely been dominated by orders of Benedictine inspiration, in the West anyway. And their purpose was to pray together. If you became a Benedictine or a Cistercian or whatever, you joined the monastery. Now we see a change. You join the order. And the order has a specific purpose. It's ordered towards the preaching of the gospel. But Dominic needed a rule. Now the Fourth Lateran Council had said we got quite enough rules. No more rules. So Dominic did something really very intelligent. He took the rule of St. Augustine, which has the great advantage of having almost no rules in it. In 1216, the order was approved by the Pope and the Council, and Dominic dispersed the brethren to go and preach and to study in all the great universities. In 1220, he held the first general chapter of the order, which approved the constitutions of the order. This is absolutely vital for our government. We are governed in accordance with our constitutions, which are evolved and approved at every general chapter of the order. In 1221, the order, the general chapter, dispersed the brethren again, sending some to Hungary, Poland, Germany, and to England. And the brethren arrived here in Oxford on the 15th of August, the Feast of the Assumption, now in 1221, shortly after Dominic had died. I should also add that from the beginning, Dominic did not conceive of us just as a community of men. From the beginning, we were a family. In fact, the very first community of Dominicans ever founded was of contemplative nuns at Pruy in the south of France, converts from Albigensianism. right from the beginning, perhaps even before the formal foundation of the order, you have great people who make their commitment to share in our mission. Beginning with St. Catherine of Siena in some sense, you see movements towards congregations of Dominican sisters, active sisters, which really took off in the 18th century. So the Master of the Order presides over a large family, about 6,000 friars, nearly all priests, about 1/6 in initial formation, about 35,000 Dominican sisters, about 3,500 contemplative nuns, and probably about 150,000 Dominican lay people. And one of the characteristics of this family was that from the beginning there was an easy relationship between men and women. When St. Dominic was dying and he confessed his sins before the brethren, he confessed that he preferred talking to young women than being talked at by old women. The second Master of the Order, Blessed Jordan of Saxony, who's my favourite, he and Blessed Diane, a Dominican nun, wrote probably the greatest love letters of medieval Christianity. If you look at Catherine of Siena, she had evidently a close, loving relationship with the then Master of the Order, Raymond of Capua. So what we see is a group of people who are characterized by love, ease, celebration. One of the earliest Dominicans ever to be beatified was called Reginald of Orleans. And when he died, he said, "I have no merit from having been a Dominican because I enjoyed it so much." The very briefest word about actually how our government works, before I get on to the essential, which is the spirituality of government. I won't go into all the branches of the order, but I'll focus on the brethren. Our government is highly democratic. We love voting as much as possible. Now, many people assume that the Middle Ages was a time of tyranny and superstition. This is absurd. You see in the 13th century a strong rise of democratic movements throughout the whole of Europe. It's 1 year after the Magna Carta. You see the evolution of parliaments. You see democracy in fraternities and guilds and in many religious orders, in canons, in universities. All over Europe, you see in the 13th century a fascination with democracy, with people having a vote and a voice. It's also just the time at the foundation of many of our great universities. And almost 800 years later, we remain extremely democratic. So, for example, every priory, to be a priory, you must have at least 6 solemnly professed brethren. We are a priory at Blackfriars in St. Charles. Every priory has the right to elect its own prior, which is then confirmed by the provincial. And when we have a provincial chapter, all these priories belong to provinces. They group the communities, the priories and houses of the order in a particular area. It might be, as in our case, Great Britain, or if you get a lot of Dominicans, you may have many provinces in one country. So there are 4 in the United States, there are 4 in Spain, and 3 in Italy, and so on. And in a province, all the priors and elected delegates elect the provincial and his council for a term of 4 years. The priors elected for 3 years, the provincial for 4. They can each be re-elected once, and then it's over. You've got to find somebody else. And then worldwide, all the provinces, of whom there are about provinces and vice provinces, probably about 55. They attend general chapters every 3 years. And every third general chapter, every 9 years, you elect a new master of the order. So a great deal of voting. And these general chapters can change or alter our constitutions. They're in constant evolution. There's enormous flexibility. So that, very briefly, is St. Dominic, and in a nutshell, his form of government. Bertrand Russell always said that if you could put something in a nutshell, you ought not to. What then is the spirituality of government? When we think of government, we probably think of control. This is a vision of government which begins to evolve really from the 16th century onwards. Charles Taylor, in his wonderful book, The Secular Age, has shown the emergence of what he calls the culture of control, the emergence of the absolute state, which will monitor us and control us with centralized powers, the multiplication of law, police force, and so on. But for Dominic, government was not about control. It was about liberating us for the mission of the order. Blessed Jordan of Saxony, second master of the order, as I said, one day a young man came rushing up to him and he shouted out, "I belong to God. I want to join the order." And Jordan said, "Since you belong to God, in his name, we make you over to him." To join the order was to be liberated for the preaching of the gospel. Dominic insisted that all our legislation had to be at the service of the mission of the order. If it got in the way, it had to be dispensed. It's one of the great principles of our legislation. One of the new things is that basically everything can be dispensed. And sometimes when the younger brethren used to be going away for the weekend, and they'd say, "Oh, Timothy, can I be dispensed from the vow of chastity this weekend?" Well, awfully sorry, we can't manage that. Once Dominic heard that some of the brethren were becoming over scrupulous about following the constitutions of the order. They were worried that they might sin by not obeying them. And he enunciated the clear principle: our constitutions don't oblige under sin. And he said that if the brethren became too obsessed with following the constitutions, he would personally go around the order with a knife and cut up all copies of the constitution. This is why one of the common images of St. Dominic is holding his knife, which is a sign of freedom. So our government should liberate us to preach. The constitutions are to serve the brethren and not the brethren the constitutions. The order isn't a prison. It should be a school of freedom. The whole of our system is founded on confidence in the brethren. When St. Dominic received the first novices in the order, he sent them out to preach. And the Cistercians said, "Oh, well, you never see them again, you know, they'll all fall in love with wild women, and that'll be the end of them." And Dominic famously said, "I will send out my young men to preach, and they will come back. You will lock up your young men, and they will still escape." We only take one vow on the constitutions, which is the vow of obedience. It's often assumed in our society that obedience is infantilizing. It's crushing your own will, doing what you're told, becoming a sort of zombie. But for St. Thomas Aquinas, who's, you know, 13th century Dominican, our greatest theologian, Thomas said, obedience is a virtue of the intelligence and not the will. It comes from audiens, which means to listen deeply and intelligently. It is always, in some sense, mutual. The brethren listening attentively to each other. When I first arrived in Rome in '92, I had to go over to the Vatican to see one of the cardinals who was very worried about our Dutch brethren. Not without reason, I might say. And he said to me, "You are the supreme authority in the order." And I said, "Well, actually, I'm not. I'm not the supreme authority in the order." He said, "Oh, who is it? Is it the Pope?" And I said, "No, it's the brethren. The brethren are the supreme authority in the order. It's the general chapter which has supreme authority. We govern by chapter. Our obedience, in the first place, is to the brethren. Between chapters, provincial chapters, general chapters, often provincials and the master of the order have to take decisions. But always this occurs through a listening, an intelligent listening to the brethren, or at least it should. But I do remember that the Irish province 50 years ago had a provincial called Coffey, David Coffey, who is usually known in the order as Instant Coffee because of his tendency to send out assignations, sending the brethren around the place without really thinking about it. Herbert McCabe, one of our brethren who lived at Blackfriars for many years, he said, obedience only becomes perfect when the one who commands and the one who obeys come to share one mind. The idea of blind obedience makes no more sense in our tradition than blind learning. The perfect obedience of Jesus to his Father wasn't a sort of robotic mindlessness. It was the mutuality of the Trinity. And secondly, our form of government is intended to preserve the unity of the order. When I was elected master in 1992, the brethren stressed your primary responsibility is to preserve the unity of the order and of the whole Dominican family. And the order embraces a vast diversity of opinion, politically and theologically. I remember when Gustavo Gutierrez, who's the founder of Liberation Theology, was summoned before the congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith by Cardinal Ratzinger. The person who welcomed him at the door was another Dominican, Archbishop Gastineau. There has to be a place for everybody. You see, most religious orders renew themselves by refoundation. So the Benedictines, for example, were renewed by the foundation of the Cistercians and the Trappists. The Franciscans were renewed by multiplying new foundations. You have the Frati Minori, you have the Conventionals, you have the Capuchins, you have the Friars of Atonement. The Carmelites renewed themselves by founding the Discalced branch. So when things are getting sloppy, what you do is you start a new order, which will live the constitutions more rigorously. And that's fine. That's in accordance with their charism. But for an order of preachers, we have to act differently. Because if you're preaching the kingdom of God, then you must remain one. Because in the kingdom, we are all brought into unity in Christ. As Paul said, there's one body and one spirit, just as you're all called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And so for us as an order, with our charism of preaching the kingdom, it would betrayal to split, ever. Now, we've hung on to our unity by the skin of our teeth sometimes. During the split papacy, when you had popes and anti-popes in the 14th century, some brethren followed one and some the other. But we still refused to buy. We remained one order. In the time of Napoleon, the time of acute nationalism, there was tremendous pressure to split, especially because the Spanish and the French couldn't divide each other. But we refused to do so. We hung on, just managed to hang on to our unity. In the First World War, in 1916, when so many of the countries in which the Brethren were fighting, we still managed to hold a general chapter in Switzerland at Fribourg, where there were delegates of all the warring nations, so that we could elect a new master of the order and cherish our unity. I think the biggest challenge for us is, how do you both remain one and speak the truth? Because those of you who are Anglican will know, the moment that you start speaking out, you're likely to have rifts, arguments, polemic. And I think actually in the whole church today, that's the big challenge, to remain one and speak the truth. The unity of our order is embodied in our system of government, which expresses our fraternity. We're all brothers, and in the wider Dominican family, brothers and sisters. That's the earliest Christian title. Our fraternity expresses our unity of Christ, unity of all human beings. Friar, we're not monks, we're friars. Friar just means brother. It's the only title in the order. There are no other titles. When I was in Rome, I had a language secretary for the four main languages, English, French, Spanish, and Italian. And I had immense difficulty in persuading the Italian secretary that all letters I had to sign over the inscription Fra Timothy Ray. And she would insist on putting Padre. And I said, well, I'm not going to sign it then. And she would say, Siamo in Italia, Padre. Once, you know, a pope a few centuries ago wanted religious orders to differentiate between the habit of novices and the habit of the professed, to show how important the profession was. But the Dominicans refused, because we said everyone who joins the order is a brother. We all wear identical habits. And when the Pope insisted, we said, okay, we'll introduce a difference, but it'll be an invisible one. We'll bless the habit of the professed. Nobody will see the difference. I remember once having a meeting with an Orthodox Archbishop at Bari in the south of Italy. And he said to me, as Master of the Order, what are your titles? Are you Serenity, Beatitude, or whatever? And I said, I'm awfully sorry. The brethren want to be really formal. They can call me brother. And then he said, what are the insignia of us? Do you have a crozier? Do you have a cross? What do you have? So I said, I'm afraid nothing at all. So he then walked away, concluding that I must be very unimportant. How does this fraternity work? I think that in our government there are two things which are very important. I mustn't talk for too long. The first is debate, and the second is to vote. According to our tradition, the point of debate is not to crush the opposition, but to draw closer to a shared truth. Dominic believed in democracy not because he believed that the majority was always right, but because he believed the Holy Spirit was poured upon each of the brethren. Everybody had something to say. The brother may be misinformed, he may argue illogically, you may disagree with him, but he always has something to offer us. The General Council of the Order consisted of 14 brethren from 14 nationalities, from 5 continents. And in our discussions we said there's only one rule. You can never rubbish the opinion of somebody else. You may say that they're wrong, but you can't say that they speak nonsense. Because that is to rubbish your brother, and it is also to rubbish the Holy Spirit. At a provincial chapter, one of our brethren, Fergus Carr, who was prior for 9 years of Blackfriars, why that happened I'll tell you at another time, he said something very beautiful, which I think sums up our spirituality. It's a long quotation, but worth it. He said to negotiate, mediate, reconcile, by making distinctions, by trying to find what is right in what is misguided and wrong-headed. It's tricky, perhaps even a risky way of proceeding. You can lose confidence in what you believe, and sometimes the objections to your own views may bring you to think differently. But if you ask me to say what I prize more and more the longer I'm in the order, I think it's a way of thinking, of expecting other people to have views we may disagree with, expecting also to be able to understand why they believe what they do. If only we have the imagination, the courage, the faith in the ultimate power of truth, the charity to listen to what others say, to listen especially for what they're afraid of, when they seem reluctant to accept what we want them to see. There are many other ways of finding truth, but that is the one I hope the order of preachers will always try to practice. So for us, debate is an expression of fraternal charity. What the medievals understood is that reasoning with your opponent is part of loving him or her as you are drawn into a more spacious truth. You have to learn how to listen. You can't have good debate unless you learn the art of listening. How is that other person using that word, which may not be as I do? When I read my first letter to the order, I gave it to my vicar, who was an American, and I anxiously waited for his reaction. But 3 days later he gave me back and he said, "I think it's quite good." I was devastated. I didn't realise that in American English, quite good means very good. I once got a letter from a Dominican from the Ivory Coast, which is addressed to "Dear Slut." I wondered who he'd been talking to until he said it was your slut provincial who gave me your address. Then I realised it probably meant something different where he came from. Probably. Absolutely finally, debate leads to vote. It's a crucial sign of the dignity of a brother that he has what we call an active voice, the right to vote. Now, one of the great innovations of the order in the 13th century was to institutionalise majority voting. Prior to then, in most religious orders, I'm not a historian, I'm open to correction, but according to a great historian, Simon Tugwell, prior to this moment, religious orders in debate would seek consensus. If they failed to attain consensus, then the abbot and his council, or the grave senior fathers, would decide, or else they would wait until a consensus could be attained. But our constitutions, Dominic, decided that when we couldn't attain consensus, we would vote. And the result is the decision of all the chapter, even of those who voted in the other direction. I think the crucial thing in our spirituality, I've bored the priors sick with this, I'm afraid, is knowing when to vote. It's very important that you don't vote too soon, before everybody's had a chance to speak. Or that you don't vote until too late, because people are utterly bored stiff. It's very important to ask, why are some people not speaking? What is the reason for their silence? Is it the silence of misunderstanding or simply incomprehension, as is my case when we talk about the accounts? Is it the silence of people who are fearful or angry or puzzled? We have to make it easy for those who are silent to speak. And we cannot vote until they've had a chance to express their reservations. Otherwise, they will never own the decision. So choosing the right moment to vote is an essential part of fraternal love. Now, the time has come to stop. What I hope you see is that our whole system of government is not bureaucratic or administrative. It's about being of one heart and one mind. It's only thus that we can preach the love of the kingdom. I hope that's enough to get the conversation going. Thank you.
Would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment? If you do, could you really speak up, because I can't stretch this over.
Did other orders learn the voting from the Dominicans? Because I believe the Benedictines vote for their abbot.
I'm not a historian. I think you had voting for superiors long before us. But we evolved towards, if you want, a much more democratic system throughout. We certainly had a role, I know, in assisting a lot of other orders to think about their forms of government. So after the death of St. Francis, there was quite a crisis within the Franciscans about government. Francis always refused to be the superior of his order, but everybody knew you could never do anything without asking his permission. So at one stage we were brought in to help the Franciscans think about how government should occur. It's the same with the Carmelites too. Most orders today elect their superior general. I don't think any other order is as democratic as us, in that basically all levels of government are elected. Most orders you elect the superior general, as he's called, and then he or she and their council often nominate the provincials, who then nominate the local superiors. That's the norm in most orders.
What happened about the Dutch Dominicans?
Rowena, I will tell you all. The Dutch Dominicans were actually behaving in a rather silly way, and they had a Calvinist minister on who lived in the community, and they just put him down to preside at the Sunday Mass with everybody else, although he wasn't actually an ordained Catholic priest, he wasn't even a Catholic. So there was a valid reason for preoccupation. But I went to see the cardinal. He said, "You must tell them to stop." I said, "Well, we don't really resolve disputes about the Eucharist, which is the sacrament, communion, just by giving orders." So I was due to Canada 10 days later. I diverted and went via Holland. And I met the whole community for 3 hours. And I said, "Look, brothers, your way of proceeding is not a good one. Let's consider all possible alternatives. All alternatives are open. Let us try to find a way forward. So how else can we do it?" So we debated until about midnight, without apparently making any great progress. And I went to bed feeling rather depressed. And the next morning, the man in question turned up and he said, "I have an idea," he said. "I rather like the idea of becoming a Catholic." So he did, he was received, he was ordained a Catholic priest. For 2 weeks in the Vatican, I was a hero. The only 2 weeks. Further trouble after I finished in Rome, when a group of Dutch Dominicans decided that if there was a shortage of priests, each congregation would simply choose and ordain its own priest, without any consultation with anybody else. Obviously a silly idea with no understanding what ordination is. So again, my successor was summoned and he was told, "You must intervene and pick them off and do all sorts of terrible things." He said, "No, that's not our way. Not our way." He got a French Dominican, Hervé Legrand, one of the great experts on church government, to write a paper which showed how not well thought out their proposal was. He then said, every community, every parish which has received your proposal, you must give them this alternative way of looking at things. And then there can be debate. That way we were able to keep peace in the order. Those are two of our exciting contacts with the Dutch Dominicans.
Are the Dutch Dominicans still?
Yes, they're still part of the order. Yes, they're still well within the order.
Yeah.
What we always think is we try as far as possible that when there are conflicts, we try to find dialogical means of resolving it.
And was Edward Spiegel's
No, Edward was very old at this time. One of my first meetings with Edward was in the pub next door. I didn't actually realise who he was. Herbert said, "This is Timothy, this is Edward, Edward, this is Timothy." And I said to him, "Oh yes, what do you do?" and he said, "I'm theologian." So I said, "Have you written any books?" Herbert started kicking me under the table. Finally I got it. Yes, they're in the order, and we're involved in a process of the renewal of the order in Holland, which is going ahead very well. It's just a question there.
Dare I ask, what advice would you give the Pope?
I did actually have the great privilege of having 40 minutes with the Pope a couple of months ago. We looked at a whole range of things. The principal, I think, main concern at this moment is the evolution of government by synod. How will this happen? And this is, in fact, a principal concern that he has at the moment. He's going to have an extraordinary synod on the family later this year, and then another synod the year after. And what we're trying, what the Pope is trying to see, and I think it's the crucial thing, is how we move from synods, which are merely consultative, advisory, to synods which are effectively decision-making. I think that's the most important thing. It goes with another element. What the Pope wants, and quite rightly, I've been arguing this for 20 years, is you have to have a decentralisation of government in the church. Basil Hume, Cardinal Basil Hume, used to say that we must shift from a position where the bishops serve the government of the church by the Pope and the Vatican, to where the Vatican serves the government of the church by the Pope and the bishops. And he said this identically, virtually word for word. So I think what we're trying to see is a deconstruction of a very centralised bureaucracy. It has its place, an important place, but it's at the service of the church. And it's been allowed to evolve into too domineering a role. Now, I was in the Vatican in November, and many people in the Vatican agree. A lot of people in the Vatican wholeheartedly agree with the Pope on this. So it's wrong to imagine that they're all, dinosaurs fighting for their power. There will be resistance. Of course, there will be massive resistance. No institution willingly gives up power. But many people in the Vatican are in favour of this. There we are.
Yeah, I'm aware that there's many Dominican, they went to Vietnam, they are sent to Vietnam to preach the gospel, and many of them died as a martyr, and they're canonized by Pope John II. I don't know, the question is where they are from England, from Spain, or what who sent them, and is there anything to do with the governance, the structure of the order? How are they in the calendar of the OP?
Oh, absolutely. We're very keen on our Vietnamese martyrs, and also our Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese martyrs. There are several hundred Dominicans who were martyred. Usually, we try, if possible, that all initiative come from as far down as possible. So, usually at the level of the province. One of the principles of Catholic government is what's called subsidiarity, which means decisions should be taken at the lowest level possible. Sometimes there are decisions for complex issues which need to be taken at the top level, simply so as to bring in support from all over the order. At the mission to Vietnam and to the Philippines was organised by the province of the Holy Rosary, which is a Spanish province. Now it's interestingly enough becoming an Asian province. Central studies in Macau, with students from Korea, from Burma, Philippines, and Vietnam. Because in Vietnam we've evolved into our own very strong province, with its own government and its own tradition.
Well, I was going to ask you about resolving conflict, because I was tremendously moved by what you said about never rubbishing people and listening, but as an Anglican, that's a problem, isn't it? I've just been reading Richard Holloway's book about leaving Alexandria, and he was so appalled by the anger and pain in the 1998 Lambeth Conference that was really why he left the church. I mean, when you've got the African bishops and the actually physically menacing the American bishops about homosexuality, I mean, you've got such geographical and cultural divisions. How do you bring that together?
I attended the whole of the last Lambeth Conference, which is very, very interesting. I would say one of the things you have to do is to take time and initiate process. In the Pope's encyclical, The Joy of the Gospel, he says, you don't have solutions, but you initiate process. I remember in a general chapter we had in Krakow, all our general chapters are in different places. Each chapter votes for the next place. we had a great conflict, generational conflict partially, about what it means to preach. So you had an older generation which had a strong stress, also generational and geographical, a strong stress on preaching as dialogue, largely from brethren who work in Asia, in dialogue with Islam, Buddhism. You had another generation, mainly from Central and Eastern Europe, which insisted on preaching as a proclamation of the truth. Many of our brethren spent years in prison. When they emerged from prison, from the Czech Republic, for example, present Cardinal Archbishop of Prague spent many years in prison. When you emerge from prison, your first thought is not to have a chummy dialogue with the communists. So what we saw was that there was a profound disagreement which blocked a chapter for quite a long time. And we saw that it couldn't be resolved in an instant. So we had to set up a commission which brought together brethren from Central Europe and Asia of different generations to work over the course of a number of years to try to understand from where the other brothers were speaking. And I think that's what you do. You don't have a solution in your pocket, but you initiate a process. When we had visitations of provinces, every province has a visitation twice within the 9 years of the master's term. Usually at the end you just sent them a letter and you said, well, you should get this and you seem to disagree about that. Occasionally you would find that there were real conflicts. So the main thing you did was to set up a process. You say, for example, in 18 months' time there should be a General Assembly over the entire province. I suggest that you choose a facilitator from this list of 6, etc., etc. But you need a great deal of imagination. And I think for us, of course, we so value that we are one, that it is unthinkable that you split. There's another question somewhere.
Having met the Pope recently, as you did, there seems to be still, even now, very little space in the church for the voice of women. I'm not talking about women priests or anything like that, but for what women can offer to the church. There are no women in senior posts in the Vatican, as far as I know.
Very few. There are some women. There's a secretary who's the number 2 of one of the congregations is a woman. And the Pope has said that this is a big priority. What form this will take, I don't know. I'm giving a talk in Dublin, in Belfast, in next week, and I shall say I think that this is the biggest question. I think the voice of women has evolved, certainly in the theological forum. When I was at the second meeting of the Catholic Theological Association of Great Britain in about 1982. At that stage, all of the theologians present were men. They were nearly all Dominicans and Jesuits. All bar 2 were priests. When I last went to the meeting a couple of years ago, 60% were lay people, and over half of those were women. So I think you could say that in the reflection of the church there's been an enormous evolution. Now, the Pope says, I don't want to clericalise women, I want to declericalise the church. And how do you do that? Part of the trouble is that until now, more recently, often the case in the past, there's a close association between what you might call sacramental power and juridical power, so that bishops and priests are the people who make the decisions. And what the Pope has said is you have to change that. Decision making must be loosened from sacramental ordination. And I think that's the crucial question, how that's going to evolve. On a minor question, there is a very strong movement for the ordination of women deacons. I think there's absolutely no theological reason why that shouldn't happen at all. That would give a voice, because we need the preaching of women to be heard, and the presence of women at marriages and funerals and baptisms and so on. So I think I'm absolutely right to point to this as one of the most, perhaps the most important issues.
If I may just give a plug to your Blackfriars, there's a series of debates starting on Tuesday called God Matters, and one of them, I can't remember, third or fourth one I think, is about the role of women in the church. There is a notice outside our building here, so do look. I want to come to the wall. We have reached time, unfortunately. I'm sure most of us would be very happy to stay for a very long time, but thank you so much for a very, very interesting talk indeed. Thank you.